The clock read 12:01 a.m. Christmas morning. He sat on the edge of his bed, eyes fixed on the door, waiting. Any second now his children should burst in, giggling, clutching presents. But the house was silent. The truth clawed its way back. There'd be no laughter this year. The kids were gone, lost to an accident months ago. Their absence echoed in the dimly lit room where shattered mirrors reflected his torment. Hands trembling, he stared at the empty space beside him. Christmas, once a time of joy. Now a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. Darkness swallowed him whole. The memory struck like a blade. A suburban street under a dull gray sky. Samantha and Ryan crossing the road, backpacks bouncing. A car approached, too fast, too careless. He wasn't there to pick them up, caught up in work, trusting it was a short walk home. The driver, barely older than Samantha, didn't see them. A screech, a crash, and everything shattered Ryan's. Goody lay still on the pavement while Samantha's fleeting hope for survival faded in a blur of sirens and despair. 20 minutes, and his world crumbled. Guilt crushed him. He was supposed to be there. He wasn't. The sound was faint at first. A soft shuffle like little feet sneaking across the floor. He froze, every nerve in his body on edge. That sound, he knew it well, had heard it 100 times on Christmas mornings past when Samantha and Ryan would try to tiptoe to the tree without waking him. For a moment, hope flared, a cruel trick played by a desperate heart. Rising from the bed, he followed the sound, his breath shallow and uneven. The door creaked as he opened it, revealing the dark, empty living room. His chest tightened. It was supposed to be here, the tree glowing softly, the kids cross-legged beneath it, presents in hand. But the room was barren, the fake tree still boxed up against the wall where it had been since last Christmas. He hadn't been able to bring himself to set it up this year. It hurt too much, but the sound came again. He turned toward the corner and his breath caught in his throat. The room changed before his eyes. The bare walls were now bathed in a flickering red light that seemed to pulsate like a heartbeat. The unopened box was gone, replaced by a towering Christmas tree fully decorated. But it wasn't the tree he remembered. Gone were the blue and silver twine and cheerful ornaments. Now it was draped in blood-red tinsel. The lights within not glowing but burning, tiny flames that licked at the branches without consuming them. The ornaments shimmered like droplets of fresh blood reflecting the fiery glow. At the base of the tree, two small figures sat with their backs to him. His breath hitched Samantha and Ryan in their matching green Christmas pajamas. He almost called out to them, but the words stuck in his throat. Something was wrong. He could see it even from where he stood. Ryan's small arm was bent grotesquely at the elbow, twisted into an unnatural shape, the hand on his present twitching uncontrollably. Samantha's head tilted to one side at a sickening angle, her neck clearly broken. Blood pooled beneath her crossed legs, staining the floor. She turned toward him slowly, her head lolling like a rag doll's. When her face came into view, his heart stopped. Her once bright eyes were now empty. Black voids and a thin red line of blood trickled upward from her lips, pooling at the corner of one eye. "Can we open our presents now, Daddy?" she asked. Her voice was familiar but wrong, deeper, hollow, devoid of the light that had once defined her. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. His legs trembled, threatening to give way, but he forced himself to stay upright. The grotesque figures of his children sat motionless, waiting for his answer. The tree's flames reflected in their dark eyes, casting the room in a nightmarish glow. He stumbled backward, clutching at the doorway for support. "This isn't real," he muttered. But deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. He stumbled out of the house, the icy night air biting at his skin. The street stretched before him, unrecognizable. The vibrant holiday lights that usually adorned the neighborhood were gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness. Only the eerie glow of a blood-red moon illuminated the scene, casting an unnatural hue over the silent world. The houses, once warm and welcoming, now stood abandoned, their windows dark and lifeless. Christmas decorations hung limp and decayed, twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock their original joy. A wet, sickening thud broke the silence reverberating through the empty streets. He turned his head toward the sound, his stomach churning with unease. It came from further down the road near an old apartment building. The sound repeated, a nauseating smack of flesh against pavement. His legs moved before his mind could process, dragging him toward the noise, each step weighed down by an invisible force. The pain in his head surged, sharp and relentless, nearly driving him to his knees. He pressed his hands to his temples, trying to will it away, but it only grew worse. The world around him warped, blurring at the edges as if reality itself were unraveling. A flicker of movement drew his gaze to a nearby house. In the window, a woman stood, her pale face ghostly in the moonlight. She wore a wedding dress, the once pristine fabric stained with dark streaks of blood. Her arm was raised as if waving, but he noticed the deep, deliberate slits that ran from her palm to her forearm. Blood dripped steadily onto the dress, pooling at her feet. Their eyes met. In her hollow gaze, he saw something familiar. An unbearable grief, a reflection of his own torment. She nodded slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared suffering, before retreating into the shadows of the house. He stumbled onward, shaken but unable to stop. The decorations on the street grew more grotesque as he walked. Wreaths hung limp, their evergreen branches withered and blackened. Candy canes lay broken and jagged. Their cheerful red stripes faded to a sickly rust color. The streetlights, wrapped in tattered tinsel, flickered weakly before plunging back into darkness. He nearly tripped over something and stopped short. Above him, hanging from one of the streetlights, was a man in a filthy Santa suit. The noose around his neck was taut, the rope creaking under the weight of his bloated body. His face was dark and swollen, his features distorted beyond recognition. Blood pooled around his bulging eyes, and his thick tongue protruded grotesquely from his mouth. Suddenly, the man's eyes shot open and his body convulsed. His legs kicked violently, and his gurgling cries filled the air. He thrashed against the noose, rocking back and forth in a futile attempt to free himself. The sight was both horrifying and heartbreaking, a soul trapped in eternal torment. Unable to bear it, he turned away and staggered forward. The thudding sound echoed again, closer this time. Each step dragged him deeper into this nightmare. A world where sorrow and horror intertwined, where the promise of escape felt impossibly far. The sound of the wet thud reverberated in his ears as he pressed on each step, feeling heavier than the last. His body screamed for rest, but the gnawing dread in his chest pushed him forward. The street stretched endlessly. The once familiar neighborhood, now a twisted, decayed shell of its former self. His surroundings seemed to close in, oppressive and stifling, as if the night itself wanted to consume him. The sound came again, impossibly loud and sickeningly close. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Turning slowly, he found himself staring at a figure sprawled on the pavement. The man's body was mangled and broken, his tailored suit torn and soaked in blood. The crimson stains spread outward, soaking into the cracked concrete beneath him. The man's face was a grotesque mask of agony. Blood seeped from his eyes, painting his neatly trimmed beard, a dark, glistening red. His limbs were bent at unnatural angles, the shattered bones jutting out from his skin like jagged spears. Yet as the protagonist watched, the man stirred. A low, guttural groan escaped the broken figure as he clawed at the ground, his hands pale and trembling, pushed against the pavement. The movement sent the jagged bones grinding against his flesh, the sound of cracking and tearing filling the air. The man's screams pierced the night, raw and primal, as his body began to contort. He couldn't look away. His feet rooted to the spot as the horror unfolded. Slowly, impossibly, the man began to rise. His spine twisted and cracked his head, lolling unnaturally to one side. The bones that had been protruding moments ago now slid back beneath the surface of his skin. His arms straightened, the grotesque bends smoothing out as though rewound by some unseen force. When the man finally stood upright, he adjusted his tattered tie and dusted off his blood-soaked jacket with surprising composure. The wounds that had marred his body moments ago were gone, leaving only faint stains on his torn clothing. In his hand, he clutched a battered briefcase, the leather peeling and stained. The man's eyes, now clear and cold, scanned the area, as if searching for something. He seemed utterly detached from the agony he had endured. His expression calm, almost bored. His gaze passed over the protagonist without acknowledgement, as if he were invisible. The man adjusted his posture, his movements deliberate and methodical, and turned toward a nearby office building. With an air of grim determination, he walked inside, disappearing into the shadows. The protagonist stood frozen. The sight of the man's impossible recovery burned into his mind. He could still hear the echoes of bones snapping and flesh tearing, the vivid memory making his stomach churn. Desperation clawed at him as he stumbled away from the scene, his legs weak and trembling. This world, whatever it was, defied all logic. The horrors he'd witnessed were etched into the fabric of this nightmarish reality. Yet something told him it was far from over. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and foreboding against the blood-red glow of the moon. His legs barely carried him, as the pain throbbed relentlessly in his skull, a vile symphony of agony and despair. Each step forward felt like dragging his body through quicksand, the world around him shifting and twisting, like a dark, surreal painting. When he reached the door, his strength gave out. With his shoulder he shoved against the wooden barrier, the aged frame groaning as it reluctantly gave way. Stumbling inside, he collapsed onto the cold, dusty floor, gasping for breath. The silence inside the house was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of the wind pressing against its decayed walls. The room was eerily familiar. It mirrored the living room from his home, a cruel replica that mocked his grief. Against the far wall stood the unopened box containing the fake Christmas tree, just as he'd left it. But here the air was different. It was heavy, oppressive, and carried a faint metallic tang as though the room itself was bleeding. He sat up slowly, his head pounding with an intensity that blurred his vision. The memories came rushing back, the laughter of his children, their excited chatter as they tore into their Christmas stockings. He could almost see them now, their small figures sitting cross-legged by the tree faces lit with joy and anticipation. The illusion was so vivid it stole his breath, but the room remained dark and empty, the cold reality twisting the knife in his heart. He leaned back against the wall, feeling the familiar weight of the gun in his hand. The icy metal was a tether to the present, grounding him in this waking nightmare. Tears welled in his eyes as he stared at the empty space where the tree should have stood. His mind, clinging to memories of a life that felt like a dream. The vibrant ornaments, the soft glow of blue and silver lights, the crinkling of wrapping paper. All of it was gone, replaced by a yawning void. The world outside the house had become a waking hell, a realm where the dead walked and horrors lurked in every shadow. But this room, this replica of his life, was worse. It wasn't the grotesque or the macabre that haunted him here. It was the absence. The suffocating silence, the emptiness, the reminder of everything he'd lost. His grip tightened around the gun as he closed his eyes, his tears tracing cold lines down his cheeks. He could hear their voices, faint but clear, calling to him from somewhere beyond. His mind conjured their laughter, their smiles, their warmth. He held on to those memories with desperate fervor, letting them drown out the weight of his guilt and despair. The cold barrel pressed against his temple, the metal biting into his skin. He whispered their names softly, a prayer to whatever cruel god ruled this place. As the tears flowed, he pulled the trigger, surrendering to the darkness that awaited. The gunshot rang out, deafening in its finality, but it gave way to an overwhelming stillness. The man opened his eyes. He wasn't dead. The cold barrel of the gun still rested against his temple, but the world around him had changed. The house was no longer dark and empty. A red, pulsating glow emanated from the corner, where the unopened Christmas tree box once stood. In its place was a fully decorated tree, twisted and unnatural. Flames flickered within the crimson tinsel, licking up toward the blood-red ornaments that seemed to pulse as though alive. Shadows danced on the walls, distorting into grotesque shapes that writhed like tortured souls. And there they were. His children sat beneath the tree just as they had in his dreams. But something was terribly wrong. Samantha's head lolled unnaturally, her neck clearly broken, her blackened eyes void of life. A thin, glistening line of blood trickled upward, defying gravity, pooling at the corner of her empty socket. Ryan sat beside her, his small arm bent grotesquely, twitching with an unnatural rhythm. Both held presents in their laps, their wrapping paper stained with dark, wet patches. "Can we open our presents now?" Daddy Samantha's voice broke the silence. It was deeper than it should have been, distorted, devoid of the joy and innocence he remembered. The man staggered backward, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The pain in his head returned sharper than ever, forcing him to his knees. The children stared at him, unblinking, their hollow eyes piercing through his very soul. The red light of the tree cast their figures in a hellish glow. They were waiting patient and still for his answer.